Hey Mustangs, in this video we're going to be reviewing speciation. So we're going to be taking a look at how new species form. So if we take a closer look at one of these images, you can see one species can branch into two different species over time. So here this arrow represents time. This is called the gradualism model. So one species can branch into two different species as we see here. Now understanding this branching is really important, especially when you're talking about cladograms. So right here, this species, at this point it branches into two different species. So if you follow the black line here, you can see how it looks like a cladogram when we create our cladograms for our phylogenetic trees. Now over here, this model is called the punctuated equilibrium model. And here you see a species continues, but parts of the species branch off and form new species over time. Species continues, parts of the species branch off and form new species over time, but the original species actually still exists. So what exactly causes this branching? So what causes one species to branch into different species over time? The biggest thing is isolation. So isolation must happen first. Now there's different types of isolation. So anytime you can take a population and basically stop two or more parts of it from interbreeding, you've caused isolation. So somehow separating the population into two different groups, or two or more different groups. There's two main types of isolation. There's prezygotic isolations, and then, oh, there should be an I there. And then there's postzygotic isolations. Once isolation has occurred, so once isolation has to happen first. Once isolation occurs and two or more parts of the species has become separated from each other, then the big three kick in. Now the big three are actually part of the 5 things that cause evolution, but these are the big 3 because these are the ones that are really going to drive speciation, drive the formation of a new species. So we have the first one, which is natural selection, genetic drift, and mutations. So these are the big 3. These are the ones that are really going to drive and push speciation forward. So the first type, we're going to look at prezygotic isolations first. So geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is when there's a physical barrier that separates the species into two or more groups. So for example, let's say you have a species living all in one area, so in here represents the species living all together, and then they become divided by a physical barrier. So there's a physical barrier that prevents them from even getting to each other. So originally you had one gene pool and all the individuals mating with each other. Now 2 gene pools have been created. Gene pool here, gene pool here. They've become isolated from each other. As a result of this isolation, over here, natural selection, mutations, genetic drift are going to happen. Over here, natural selection, mutations, genetic drift are going to happen. And it's probably not going to be the same, especially if it's 2 different environments, right? Natural selection will be happening different on both sides. If a mutation happens here, doesn't mean the same mutation is going to happen over here. So different mutations will build in each side, changing the gene pool, adding new alleles to the gene pools. And then genetic drift. If genetic drift happens here, a fire doesn't mean a fire is going to happen over here. So change builds up. So eventually, while these 2 started as the same species, as these 3 things happen to them, they change and they become different. And they become more different and more different, till eventually they've changed so much from each other that they can no longer mate and produce fertile offspring. At that point, speciation has occurred. New species have formed. All right, an example of this, let's say the lake dries up here. And these are all the same species of fish. Their variation here in this case is just simplified as color. And let's say on one side the lake changes, and as a result of that, natural selection drives forward, and you get a change in color. Okay? So let's say that's just one thing. And then let's say over here, we can add more to it. Let's say over here, eyes change. So maybe the eyes become bigger and bulkier over here. Maybe there's a mutation, and that's a favorable mutation, so they have bigger, bulkier eyes over here. And then over here, there's a mutation, and there's addition of a fin. And then a chemical comes in and wipes out the pink fish, but the yellow fish have a certain enzyme that they make that allows them to survive. And so we could keep this game going here, where we can see that changes build up on one side, different changes build up on the other, and they start to change and become more and more different over time until they become 2 different species. So the big 3, natural selection, mutations, genetic drift, natural selection, mutations, genetic drift. And that's actually an example of the pupfish from Death Valley. So the pupfish in Death Valley, it's believed that there used to be one large lake, and it's dried up into smaller lakes over time in Death Valley. And if you look at the pupfish in the different lakes, they look and behave differently than each other, as we see here. So we see the big three happened in those cases. A classic example is the Grand Canyon squirrels. Okay, so you had a species of squirrel that got separated by the Grand Canyon as the Colorado came through and formed it. They got isolated onto the two different sides of the Grand Canyon. And let's say over here we have a foresty area, over here we have more of a deserty area. And as time progressed, the big three happened: natural selection, mutations, genetic drift. So over here these change, become different over time. And over here on the other side, they change, become different over time, until eventually they become so different that they would be considered two different species. They no longer mate, and they can't produce fertile offspring. All right, more examples of prezygotic isolation. Now, looking at prezygotic isolations, we have habitat isolation, behavior isolation, and temporal isolation. Now, all of these, and I didn't say this earlier in the video, and I should have, all of these are prezygotic. So pre means before. Zygotic, think about what a zygote is, when the sperm and egg come together. So this happens before a species mates. And it usually prevents them from mating, basically. So anything that's prezygotic has to do with preventing from mating. So the first one, take a look at habitat isolation. Habitat isolation is interesting. It's not geographic isolation. Geographic is bigger and grander when it comes to their separation. Here with habitat isolation, they actually live in the same place, but they live in two different habitats. So these two snakes, for example, were the same species, but they became isolated when some decided to live almost their entire lives in water, while others remained living in land and even in trees. So even though they live in the same area, they live in two different habitats. Okay? It's kind of like living in New York City, and one person lives in a fancy high-rise and another one lives in Harlem. They're probably not going to see each other. Even though they live in the same area, they live in two different habitats, basically, two different worlds almost. So that's what we see in habitat isolation. So since they're isolated by their habitats, they're not going to get together and mate. They've become isolated by where they live. Behavioral isolation. Behavioral isolation is one of my favorite ones to look at. So with behavioral isolation, again, there's no physical barriers here, just like with habitat, they all live in the same place. So imagine here you have a group of the same species living in the same place, and they all do a specific behavior for attracting a mate. Now that sounds silly to us because in humans we don't have a very specific thing that we have to do to attract a mate, but in many species there's something very specific, a very specific behavior they must do in order to attract a mate, and if they don't do that behavior right, that means they don't mate. So here with behavioral isolation, it's all about what behavior do they do to attract a mate. So imagine you have a group of the same species all living in the same place, and a small group of them start doing a different behavior. And that small group, because they do a different behavior, they will only mate with others that like that behavior. These guys will only mate with others that like the original behavior, and they will no longer mate with each other. Good example is birds. Birds sing very specific songs, and if they don't sing, and it's usually the males, so the males sing a very specific song, the females listen, and they pick the ones that they feel sing the song the best. So if a male doesn't sing the song right, the female doesn't pick him. So if a male starts singing a song differently, what usually happens is that male doesn't mate because none of the females like the way it sounds. He's not singing the song correctly. But every now and then, a male gets lucky. He sings a different song, and a small group of females like it, and that gets passed on generation after generation. So they start singing a different song to attract females, and they've become behaviorally isolated. These guys sing one song, the rest out here sing another song. They will no longer mate with each other. That's the first step of speciation right there. And once this occurs, natural selection, mutations, genetic drift happen here. Natural selection, mutations, genetic drift happen here. And it's all happening within the same area. So they still see each other, they fly by each other, all that stuff, but they are no longer mating with each other. Basically, we've created two different gene pools here. So here's one gene pool, here's the other gene pool. They're not going to share DNA anymore. They're not going to mix their alleles anymore. All right, temporal isolation is very similar to behavioral isolation. So with temporal isolation, temporal, don't think temporary. Temporal means time. So it has to do with timing here. Again, you have to step away from being human because humans, we don't have a specific time of year where we have like a breeding season or something like that, but most plants and animals actually do. They have a specific time of the year when they're actually going to mate. So here in temporal isolation, again, let's picture we have a population and they all mate in, let's say, June. So the population mates in June, that's their breeding season. If an individual doesn't mate during that time, that usually means they don't mate at all. But let's say a small group of them start mating during September, that's too far ahead. Let's say during August instead. Okay, so if a small group of them start mating during August instead, these guys will only mate in August, these guys will only mate in June. They have become temporally, not temporarily, temporally isolated. They're isolated by the time of the year that they mate. These guys will only mate in June. These guys will only mate in August. We have 2 gene pools that have been created now. So even though this was part of the original whole gene pool, now we have a new gene pool that's been created. They no longer share genes so that they don't mix their alleles in the gene pools, and they start to change and become different over time. So this group that mates in June, they continue to mate with each other and they have their own unique gene pool. Natural selection, mutations, genetic drift can change that gene pool, but different effects, different changes are probably going to happen here with natural selection, mutations, and genetic drift in this smaller group. And they change and become different over time until eventually they become so different that they are no longer the same species. All right. Now, allopatric and sympatric speciation. It's referring to the stuff that we just learned. So we have to take a look at all the different types of isolations we just looked at, and then we can apply these terms to it. So allopatric speciation is speciation that occurs in the presence of a physical barrier. Okay. Well, if you think about it, the most obvious one is geographic isolation. So geographic isolation is an example of allopatric speciation. Speciation that occurs when there's a physical barrier that actually divides the population into 2 gene pools. So a physical barrier that's hard for them to cross. Sympatric speciation is speciation that occurs when there's no barriers. So that is your habitat isolation, your behavioral isolation, and your temporal isolation. They're all still living in the same area together. It's just a small group of them has formed their own gene pool and is changing differently compared to the bigger group until they become 2 different species. All right, last thing is postzygotic isolation. So everything we've talked about up to this point has been pre-zygotic, something that prevents them from mating before the zygote can even be formed. Here is post-zygotic isolation. So post means after. So there are some species that can mate and produce babies, but their babies can't have babies, or their babies are very sickly and they die very young. So that's post. Now, usually these species, the reason why they can do this is it wasn't that long ago they were the same species and they started to branch off and form different species, and they haven't changed that much. They've changed enough to where if they do mate, their babies are infertile or sickly, but they're still similar enough that they can still have babies. Now, if we give these species more time, you might find that as time passes, that they become so different that they can no longer even mate and produce any offspring at all. So really good example of this. Again, here we have a hybrid. We call any time you have 2 species that can form babies, but their babies are not very viable, or they're not very fertile, or not fertile, we call it a hybrid. So if we take a look here at this example, lions and tigers. Lions and tigers used to be the same species, and they've more recently branched, so they're still similar enough that they can mate, but they're different enough that their babies are either not very viable or infertile. So here, if you take a female tiger and a male lion, you form a liger, and the ligers are infertile. If you were to switch them, if you had a male tiger and a female lion, you actually get a tigon instead. And tigons are usually small and sickly and have mental problems. So that would be examples of post-zygotic isolation. And this usually only works, like I said, with species that had a very recent common ancestor. And they've changed, but not enough to not have babies yet. So the big thing with speciation is that isolation has to happen first. So first, some sort of isolation must occur to form 2 distinct gene pools, and then once those 2 distinct gene pools have been formed, then the big 3, natural selection, genetic drift, and mutations take over and change them until they change so much that the 2 groups become different species.